Okay.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get rolling. I'll give an introduction to Dr. Wakefield. So Dr. Wakefield, Ph.D., LCSW, CST, is a therapist working at the Couple Center at UMS and teaches many workshops. She has also authored several books, such as The Labyrinth of Love, In Search of Aphrodite, and Negotiating the Inner Peace Treaty. She is involved in our psychiatry residency therapy supervision, and we are very thankful for that support. We are excited to hear Dr. Wakefield's talk titled Career Reflections, A Growth Mindset, Important Mentors, and the Importance of Meaning. And with that, we'll give it over to Dr. Wakefield.
Thank you. So I wanted to share some things that a lot of people don't know about me because I don't just voluntarily talk about them. I began my early years in music. And again, this is something that most people don't know about me. I was 10 years in classical piano. And my first piano teacher really instilled in me a love of music and creativity, which I think has stayed with me my whole life. I composed little pieces of music and she transcribed them and illustrated them, and she just was really a wonderful early mentor in my life. There were a lot of things I think I learned through music, which has actually helped me in terms of my writing career. And that was how to endure many hours of solitary activity while you're learning and struggling to learn something. And the other thing about music is there's a tipping point in music where when you get the foundations mastered, suddenly you can make art. You can really play. You can put a piece of music in front of you. You can read it. And one of the things that I did after my 10th year of classical is I felt that I was just tired of the constraints of classical music, and I wanted to play with others. So I started to learn how to play by ear, and I started to learn how to play jazz, and I sought out people who could teach me, like, that sound. How do you make that sound on this keyboard? And so that was a really exciting dimension of my life, and I think it's related to that process of seeking out people who know stuff has been something that I've done my whole life. So years later, when I was a young therapist and working in a clinic that did a lot of family work, a lot of adoption, and we did wraparound psychotherapy. It was a wonderful place to work. It was called Crossroads Counseling. It was in Hickory, North Carolina, and with a great group of clinicians, and we had a psychiatrist and a nurse practitioner, and it was just really wonderful. And over time, the therapists there started to say, you're really gifted with the couples. And so while they would split up and some would work with the kids, I would work a lot with the couples, and I began to study couples work. And I started with the Gottman approach, and then what happened over time is I would run into limitations of models. And I would think to myself, this doesn't work in this way, or there's a problem that seems unfixable in this way. And so I would go in search of someone who knew the next level of how to do stuff. And so over time, it's how I became an integrationist in terms of the way that I work, because I would go and I would learn about attachment theory, and then I would learn about regulation, like what happens with people who can't regulate their bodies. They can't stay calm enough to communicate with each other. What about people who can't perspective take, which means crossing the bridge into the other person's world and really being curious about how that other person operates, and what is the history that drives people to be certain ways and think certain ways. So another aspect I think that has been a strength of mine over life has been my love of learning and my just intense curiosity about how things work. And when you bump into a dead end, somebody knows something about this. There's something that we don't know. So I think being a slightly divergent thinker, I think having a jazz background where you have foundations in place, but then you have a bevy of possibilities that you can access. And so learning to master the basics of psychotherapy and working with people, but I don't think much anymore when I'm working with people, because it's much more like jazz. It's sort of like in the moment of whatever I have in front of me, I can apply, I can shift, I can alternate, and So I think my musical history was tremendously helpful for me. I also recognized that in my first year of college, one of the things that I did when I was anxious, I would go to the practice room and I would find chord progressions and things on the instrument that were soothing to me, and I would play them over and over again. And at that time I didn't realize what I was doing, but I was using not only the sound of the music and the motion of playing things as a way of soothing and regulating my nervous system. So music has always been very important. It has opened a lot of doors for me. It took me to New York City because I started to earn my living playing music, and I was introduced to a lot of people in a lot of doorways playing music. When I was in New York City, I tired of the nightlife, and I decided I wanted to segue into something different. And so I got a job at Northern Telecom, being in customer service and such. And over time, working in that job and other jobs, people would say things to me like, "Chelsea, this is not social work." And I would start to think to myself, I wonder if there's a message here. And I heard it so often that eventually I began to look into what would it mean for me to get a master's in social work. And that was the first step of what I did. And I worked for many years at that level. And then I began to work with couples. And then I had a way of thinking of myself. And this is something that I talked to the residents about. And I was so amazed recently how one of the residents brought in a book called Mind Over Mood, because Dennis Greenberger was one of my first therapists. He was out in California. This book has sold over 1 million copies. It's a cognitive behavioral book. So I'm going to tell a little story about like some of my own personal therapy. So this was a year after my son was born, and I had a little bit of postpartum depression. And there was some stuff going on in my larger family that was really challenging. And I found myself laying on the couch and I couldn't get off. And I thought to myself, this is not good for having an infant. I've got to go get some help. And somehow I wound up in Dennis Greenberger's office, the guy who wrote Mind Over Mood. And Dennis worked with me for about 12 sessions. And in the midst of that, I went home and I engaged in a journal process where I named my inner cast of characters. So I named these different sub-personalities that were in me. And I brought this in and said to Dennis, or Dr. Greenberger, I said, "Does this mean I have a multiple personality disorder?" And he said, "No, I think you seem to be presenting as pretty integrated." And we did a few more sessions, and then he pronounced me cured. And what I realized is that the experience that I had had was of a kind of sadness that had periodically overtaken me in my life. It wasn't deep depression, but it was definitely a dysthymia. And it was rooted in things like, the needs that weren't being met and certain things that were going on in my home life. And it felt like Grendel had crawled out of the murky deep and grabbed me and pulled me back into the murky deep. And I did not trust what Dr. Greenberger said when he said, "You're good, you're thinking well, you're feeling well, you're cured." I felt nervous about when would Grendel come back and get me again. And I lived with that anxiety for a long time. When I was in social work school getting my master's degree, I encountered the work of Carl Jung. And there was something about the integration of possibility, the idea that we each have a compass inside, which can guide our lives. And also that with the right existential alignment, people get happy and they get okay. And so I eventually went into Jungian analysis. And this was where I did my Grendel work. And that was many, many years ago, and I did about 100 hours of Jungian analysis. And I no longer live I haven't lived for years, maybe about 15 years, with not that sense of hovering dread that something is going to perhaps maybe descend on me if I enter into a life situation which is challenging. And that has been so wonderful, but it was only in the depth psychology work that I did, really looking at formation and really looking at the analytic dimensions of my personality, that I was able to get at some of the stuff that was operating autonomously in me, that was outside of awareness, and that as soon as I could excavate it and look at the sources of it and restory it, and to get my outside life aligned with my inside life, which was really, really important. And it's something that I emphasize to the residents and to the patients that I work with, that until you get your outside life aligned with your inside life, you'll always be anxious. It doesn't matter how much medication you're taking. There'll always be something that feels off. And so that's been a core value of mine, to figure out, like, what is my gift to the earth? That has been an important question in my life. What is my gift to the earth? And in thinking about that, I've really realized that if I can facilitate more loving relationships on the face of the earth and more people feeling a sense of alignment, inner and outer, this is what I most love to do. So with that going back to the inner cast of characters, I started to look around, like, who does this kind of work, this part psychology? And at that time, which was about 25 years ago, nobody was doing this work. Now, nowadays, Richard Schwartz, with Internal Family Systems, it's like the core of the work that he does, and has become very popular in the world of psychotherapy, this part psychology. So wherever I encountered people who worked with ego states or part psychology or dimensions of self, I would go and study. It was another thing that I loved about Jungian psychology, because it allowed for a lot of different parts of self, and the idea that we often have contradictory parts of self. And that understanding has helped me a lot in my life, that people are complicated and often contradictory, and that life is messy, and that, just being able to navigate the messiness of life and the contradictions in people is part of navigating life, and particularly in marriage, where you find that even though you might have a lot in common, you have a lot of differences. And so my marriage, my 35-year marriage, which is my second marriage, has been a huge path of growth for me in learning how to deal with differences and disappointments and disillusionments, and to really value, with great gratitude, the goodness that is there, and how we have created a life together that has been very meaningful. So following a path of meaning has been very important for me. It was part of the reason why initially, even though my parents, my father really wanted me to become a concert pianist, and my mother wanted me to go higher into education. And I left both of those and sort of had a little bit of inner rebel for a while. And then oddly enough, here I am in academia, teaching, and with the Ph.D. So I didn't get my Ph.D. until my son was a junior in high school. And what had happened by then is that my son, I realized that he was going to be gone and we would be in an empty nest. We had one child. And in my couples work, I was recognizing that there was an area of that couples work that I didn't know much about how to help. And it had to do with sexuality and the sexual couples, the problems that couples had in sexuality. And I had, my husband had been through his first bout of cancer, and we had had some struggles around the treatment around his cancer and our own sexual life, which had always been good, but had kind of fallen by the wayside. And I wanted to revive that and was trying to figure out how to do that. And so I began to study sex therapy. And in the process of doing that, I met one of the most important mentors of my life, who is Gina Ogden. And I met Gina Ogden, and I'd been in Jungian analysis, and I'd been kind of thinking about sexuality through an archetypal lens. And she said to me, you need to get your PhD because your ideas are very creative and very unusual and very helpful. And so I started into a PhD program, and which I hadn't really intended to do. And I had this wonderful husband, who was willing to take care of our son while I drove down to Florida and finished a PhD, and then came back and for 2 years wrote a dissertation and engaged in that. And that did indeed open a lot of doors for me. But Gina Ogden was an important mentor on a lot of levels, because when I met her, she was in her late 70s and still very vital and very active. She encouraged me to join ASECT, which is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, which is a really interesting organization where I presented a lot and learned a lot. And Gina lived in a townhouse, a 3-story townhouse, right across from the Harvard dorms up in Cambridge. And so I used to go up and visit her periodically and stay in her house with her life partner, Joe. And we would go down to Walden Pond and swim in Walden Pond. And we would go out to Singing Beach, and we would sit on the beach and we would talk about ideas. And she was very interested in my ideas, and I was interested in hers. And we began to edit each other's books. And I had written Negotiating the Inner Peace Treaty by then to kind of describe my parts work that I was doing. And I was working on my PhD dissertation. And she was a published writer with Routledge, which most people pronounce Rutledge, but if you go to the publisher, they will tell you it's Routledge. And so I went to a marriage and family therapist one year where she was presenting, and she said, come to lunch with me. I'll introduce you to my publisher, my editor. And she pitched my book, my second book. And that was how I got the Routledge contract, because Marta Mulday, who was the editor, really liked what I was working on. And she said, when you finish your dissertation, come talk to me and let's talk about a book. And so that was where In Search of Aphrodite came from, with really looking at women's sexuality through an archetypal lens or a part psychology lens, and looking at something that I also believe is true, which is that we can do many things in life from many different places inside. So as a mental health practitioner, you can be a healer, you can be a teacher, you can be an advocate. There's a whole spectrum of things that you can be in the course of being a mental health practitioner. And being clear about where you're coming from, and perhaps even exploring shifting to a different orientation can change many things in life. It's kind of like Marcel Proust once said that the journey of discovery doesn't come so much from visiting many different places, but from seeing with new eyes. So this idea of seeing with new eyes, coming from a different place into life, has been an important way for me to navigate many of the experiences that I've had in life, is to recontextualize, restory, reinterpret, assign different meaning to things. And that's been very helpful, and it's something that I try to get across to people that I'm working with, that the story that they're stuck in can often limit their lives, and we need to restory, recontextualize, assign different meaning to those things. So writing has been an important part of my, I think, becoming a better clinician and in defining who I am and how I think, and to some degree being a divergent thinker. I think being a divergent thinker is something you have to have a lot of courage to do. My divergence, just like good art, is based on a deep study of the fundamentals and then asking different questions. Like, why is this the only way to think about that? You know, what if we tried this? What if we mixed this with that? What if we invited people in a different way? So there's been a lot of curiosity and improvisation in terms of my life story. uh, the last two books that I wrote, someone once pointed out to me that there are people who try to get books published for years, try to get in the door of a publisher, and both of those books I was approached by the publisher to write the book. So Labyrinth of Love, which was published by Chiron, who is a Jungian-oriented publisher, Steve Busser came to me and said, we don't have anything on relationships. I would really like to have you write something about the idea that in the Jungian world, the journey of individuation, which is becoming who you were born to be, is very, very important. And I had created this idea of individuation and connection, how two people can walk that journey of discovery and becoming together, and in that journey together have a really deep and wonderful life. So this was a new concept in the Jungian world, and he wanted me to write about it. And so I wrote about the roadmap of relationship, which in every single intimate relationship, including friendships, you've got this idealization period, it's kind of limerence and wonderful beginning, and then you always have these disillusionments. And the disillusionments can be expectations that were not met. They can be projections that you had, where you thought this person was a certain way and it turns out they weren't that way. And that was originating over here rather than who that person actually was. So talking about the role of projection and talking about how at that juncture, the real relationship actually begins. And I can think of in my own life, the early idealization of my husband and how we started out in a very romantic sense. And then I discovered the warts and the places where he was, in my opinion, deficient. And for a while I was very cynical about, did I marry the wrong person? How am I going to do a lifetime with this person? And then there was a process of growth in me that occurred, where I was able to withdraw those demands, and a really interesting thing happened in the midst of that, and that is that as I stopped being so critical, he started relaxing and different parts of him started showing up, and the relationship improved, and we were able to kind of something that I think is incredibly important to do, which is to define the life and then redefine the life and then redefine the life at every age and stage of life. So now in my 60s, and he's a little bit older than me, we're looking at, he's already retired, and we're just kind of looking at just what happens after a long life together, where there's some health issues and things of that sort, and the depth of gratitude that I feel for having been with someone who has given me so much freedom and so much support in my life to become and then to become again. Because he's been nothing but supportive in every goal that I ever had. He's just been a cheerleader and a supporter, and that's something I'm very grateful for. So last year, I think it's also important in life to be able to fall down and get up. I think that falling down and getting up is an incredibly important thing to be able to do. And so I started attending a writer's group, which I would encourage everyone that has a creative project. It doesn't necessarily have to be an article or a book, but any creative project, a PowerPoint, a grant proposal, anything to attend. And this was really hard because I'd written one published journal article, but most of my writing had been books, where I could kind of spread out and talk about a lot of different things really thoroughly and really deeply. And so this process of distilling these big ideas down into little, 2,000 words, 4,000 words was painful. And I had a lot of feedback and a lot of teasing that went on about, Chelsea, this is not a book. And but I wanted to stay with it because it was a process of learning again for me, something that I wasn't good at, that I wasn't doing well. And so I stuck with it, and I finally have gotten to a place where, I literally wrote an 1,800-word article a couple of months ago. So this is something that, with the encouragement of people wanting to get my ideas into the stream where people can search them, as articles and not have to buy a book. So that's one of my next professional goals, is to get more of my ideas into the literature stream in that form. So I'm trying to think of something that my high school English teacher pointed out to me, which has been also important in my life. She gave me my first C- on a paper, and I was very upset. And I went up to her and I said, I don't understand. I worked so hard on this thing. And she said, well, would you like to sit down and I'll explain to you what the problem is and I'll give you the opportunity to rewrite the paper, which was a wonderful thing. So she sat down with me and she said, Chelsea, you have 10 ideas in this paper. It's a 5-paragraph essay. That means there should be 3 ideas that you support very deeply. Not, I see how many ideas you had, but let's do 3 ideas that you support deeply. And so I went home and I rewrote the paper and I got my A. This has been something that has carried on throughout my entire life because I'm an expander rather than a contractor. And so I've had to continue to prune the tree in terms of what I can accomplish in a lifetime, what I can do in a year, etc. And that I think it's important to recognize dimensions of oneself that are things that can be positives and negatives. Because again, being able to be very creative and generate a lot of ideas is a wonderful thing, and many possibilities, and 15 articles you might write, and 2 more books, and things of that sort. And even in my teaching, it's like, how much can you actually convey that is really relevant rather than everything you know? So that's been something that I have more compassion on myself because I realize it's just kind of the way my brain works. But also being willing to contain, to anchor, and to limit in a positive constructive way. And to forego things that are really interesting, because I find much of life very interesting. So I could just chase rabbit trails endlessly. And to learn to contain that and to say, oh, that's very interesting, but we're on this path right now. So that's a lot of what I reflect on. So, the importance of, the other thing about mentorship is that I would encourage people, if you go to something and you're interested in what's being presented, go up and talk to the person in the front of the room. I started doing that when I was much younger, and I found that that people actually enjoyed that. Now that I'm a presenter, I love it when people come up and talk to me. And I'm happy to give out resources and ideas and things of that sort if there's a need there. And over time, I found that was the case. I kind of felt like, who am I to go up and talk to this person? But then I got a little bit more audacious and got a little bit of chutzpah going, and I started doing it. And I found that it was rewarding for me, and it seemed to be something they were really willing to do. Send me an article, connect me. Like, there's somebody I know who you might want to talk to this person. And then to go and talk to that person and to widen the scope. Particularly interdisciplinary scope of getting out of your own little silo and being interested in a lot of different things. And just noticing the threads of connection and similarity, the common factors amongst people and amongst fields that can really enrich our ways of looking at things. The other thing that I think I've learned over the course of my life, being somewhat introverted, is that I have a collection of friends that I have very deep relationships with. And they're kind of scattered because I've lived in a lot of different places. I've lived in California, and I've lived in New York City, and I've lived in North Carolina for a long time, and now I've been here for 7 years. But friendships are really important, and having colleagues you can talk to. And not being afraid to be real in those environments and really reveal yourself, because that's how those deep bonds are created, is when people can get real. So the friendships that I've collected over the past 40 years have been people who are growth oriented and people who can be vulnerable and people who can be real. They also have a little bit of thread of they're pretty much all bright people, but people who can also be vulnerable, because it was something that I had to learn to do in a high achieving family, was to be vulnerable and to be real and not to feel like allowing people to know me was dangerous. So anyway, thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Wakefield. That was great. So I want to give folks time to ask some questions. In particular, what was fascinating for me to hear your story, Dr. Wakefield, is going through therapy supervision with you. You know, I'd hear you talk about quite a bit the inner cast of characters someone is coming and presenting with, and that was really cool to hear where that came from in your own background, and also just the concepts of aligning the inner self with the outer self, and seeing things with, maybe it's not about the experience, it's the Proust quote that you mentioned, not about the experiences you have or the places you travel, so to speak, but seeing things with a different lens. And so those were really interesting to hear how you came across those ideas and concepts. And so we'll turn it over to the audience now. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Wakefield? Anyone in the chat or anyone here in person?
Yeah, who the hell is this Grendel thing?
So, Dr. It's a literary reference to the story of Beowulf, which hopefully you all studied or probably hated when you were in high school. But I always liked that the image of the monster from the deep that could come up onto land and, you know, grab you and haul you back and eat you. Yeah.
I'll take him out for you if you want.
Oh, good. I'll call you next time if I see him again.
All right. Well, for the length of recording, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just stop the recording just so we have an upload there. But if anyone else has any questions in the chat or
comments.
Or comments, yeah, we can hang around. But thank you so much, Dr. Wakefield. That was
You're
great.
welcome.